Good afternoon. Welcome to the Roundtable on the Rise of Indo-Pacific, Entanglements with China and Southeast Asia. To everyone who went all the way to the Asian Center despite the transportation strike, and to those who are on Zoom, thank you for joining our discussion this afternoon. I am Dulce Natividad, Associate Professor at the Asian Center, and I will serve as the moderator for the session. Recently, the Indo-Pacific has emerged as a new regional economic power and geopolitical actor, spanning the geo-oceanic systems, countries, and cultures around the Indian and Pacific Oceans. The construction of this region needs interrogation. What is the Indo-Pacific? Who are the actors in this region? What are the strategic interests of these actors? Apart from the economic and geopolitical, how do we bring in the socio-cultural dimensions in examining this region? This event is made more significant as this activity launches the Asian Center's Introducing South Asia series, which aims to raise awareness and interest about developments in the region and its dynamic with the Philippines and other parts of Asia. In addition, this series is expected to promote the Center's South Asia Studies program. Before we proceed, let me acknowledge our RTD participants. We are excited to see gathered in one room scholars of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and China studies, as well as experts in international relations, strategic studies, and sociocultural studies. So let me just read the names of the people who are with us today. Dr. Sadia Sultana from the Shuchona Children's Bangla Virtual Class. His Excellency Ambassador Borhan Udin of the Embassy of the People's Republic of Bangladesh. Assistant Professor Edsel John Ibarra from the Department of Political Science, UP, CSSP. Dr. Aaron Jed Rabena, Research Fellow from the Asia Pacific Pathways to Progress. Professor Ramon Guillermo, Director, Center for International Studies, University of the Philippines, Diliman. Dr. Romel Banlawi, Director, Center for Intelligence and National Security Studies, Philippine Institute for Peace, Violence, and Terrorism Research. Professor Richard Darian, who is a lecturer here at the Asian Center. Dr. Wickremang Singhe, Director General of the Colombo Plan Staff College. We have Ms. Darlene Estrada, who is Political Officer from the British Embassy, Manila. We have Mr. Don McLean Gill, a geopolitical analyst and author. We have Professor John Rennie Short from the School of Public Policy, University of Maryland, Baltimore. We also have Professor Caroline Sobrichea from the Asian Center, Deputy Director Yojiro Tanaka from the Japan Foundation, Mr. Carlos Ortiz from the Japan Foundation. Of course, we have from the Asian Center faculty, Dean Henelito Sevilla, former Dean Jofe Santa Rita, Professor Tina Clemente, Professor Antoinette Raquisa, Professor Noel Christian Moratilla, Professor Matthew Santamaria. Did I miss anyone? Professor Cecil Medina. And of course, we have our Professor Herman Joseph Kraft from the UP Political Science Department. And of course, we have our guest speaker. Professor Naval, yes, from the Political Science Department also of UP. If I miss anyone, I'll mention your names later. Okay, so without any further ado, let me call the Dean of the Asian Center, Professor Henelito Sevilla, to give the welcome remarks.
our esteemed
speaker, Professor Rina,
Excellency Ambassador of Bangladesh in Manila, Ambassador Burhanuddin, Professor Kraft, Professor Romel, my esteemed colleagues in international studies and other discipline. I cannot mention all of you. Friends of Asian Center, and we have also a friend from Japan Foundation. A pleasant good afternoon to all of us. The geopolitical and economic realities that have emerged in the wider Asia-Pacific region has been subjected to inquiry by a number of scholars, policymakers, and diplomats from different parts of the world in the last few years. Many have attempted to interrogate what the region can offer to the world and how the current development would shape or determine the future regional, geopolitical, and economic standing. As we enter into the new era of economic integration and collaboration, side by side with increasing intensity of competition between and among rival powers in the region, the Asia-Pacific region becomes more and more strategically relevant to the world, both in terms of the future well-being of the global economy, as well as in terms of understanding the future direction of international politics. In addition, these regional developments can also stimulate scholars from humanities and social sciences to inquire how culture, as an important element of soft power and national projection, can be utilized to achieve results. Issues about climate change and enforced human migration resulting from the above require serious interrogation from different disciplines and by government officials, as well as by the international community. In the context of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the rise of China as a regional and global economic power, the international presence of the US and European countries in the region through new security arrangement, the rivalries of global powers over the control of markets in Asia-Pacific region, the rise and look eastward projection of India's foreign policy to cultivate political and economic ties with the country of Southeast Asia, the strategic, economic, and maritime values attached to Asia-Pacific region and its importance to global economy, the striking climate change and environmental issues facing the Asia-Pacific region, the role of ASEAN in managing and diffusing tension in Southeast Asia and the Pacific are immediate issues that needed to be addressed when one speaks of regional preservation of peace and sustainable development. This would necessitate proper interrogation from among scholars and practitioners. Given the scenario, it is hardly difficult for us to speak of Asia independent of the Pacific or vice versa, or to speak of Asia Pacific as detached from the international politics or international economy. Therefore, today's roundtable discussion is expected to interrogate the concept and the operationalization of the so-called Indo-Pacific, which was probably, as you read it in the many literatures, born out from May 31, 2019 consultation of senior officials from Japan, the United States, India, and Australia, or the so-called Quad in Bangkok, Thailand. From the word itself, the Indo-Pacific suggests a geographical expansion of security engagements, which starts from India to Southeast Asia and to the Pacific region. Moreover, the idea of Indo-Pacific is also adopted by other countries such as France, the United Kingdom, Indonesia, and ASEAN as a policy symbol of regional engagement based either on the perceived individual or common values and interests. Whatever the sources of the Indo-Pacific concept and whoever defines it, whatever its purpose, I think it is important that our interrogation today shall also consider inclusivity and also, of course, from a multidisciplinary approach and not just geopolitics. We have to consider this, and we should not be just looking at a perspective clinging to one side of the scholarship production. Perhaps a balanced interrogation of the idea that look into the interest of concerned actors and entities may be comprehensive and effective enough in producing an encompassing understanding or outcome of the so-called Asia-Pacific. As the concept of Indo-Pacific is a construction of those countries who use it either geographically, define the extent and relevance of the region in terms of extensive security engagement towards the Indo-Pacific, it is moreover important to inquire the following. Is the idea of Indo-Pacific originated from the common resolve of these countries to counter possible hegemonic tendency of China in a wider Indo-Pacific region? What does it mean of Indo-Pacific for individual countries in the Asia-Pacific context? What does it mean for India? What does it mean to the centrality of ASEAN? What does it mean for China? And what does it mean for regional culture, the environment, and the people's migration and displacement in the wider Asia-Pacific region? In this connection, ladies and gentlemen, let me emphasize that we at the Asian Center is happy to welcome this initiative, as our center mission and vision is aimed at, and I quote, developing a closer and broader contact with our Asian neighbors in the field of learning and scholarship to attain knowledge of our national identity in relation to other Asian nations through profound studies of Asian cultures, history, social forces, and aspiration. And number two, and I quote, serving as a research hub for Asian studies and Philippine studies in the Philippines, and help create a society aware of and appreciative of its Asian and Filipino heritage in ways that promote Filipino identity and its relations with its Asian neighbors. Our program at the Asian Center encompasses Philippine and Asian studies, and it is our immediate task to promote the Philippines in Asia and Asia in the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, in finality, allow me to welcome our esteemed speaker for today, Professor Rina Marwa. Let's give her a round of applause. Allow me also to welcome once again our distinguished reactors, Professor Herman Karap and Professor Santa Maria, and our esteemed participants of today's roundtable discussion. I look forward to having a fruitful discussion at maraming salamat sa inyong lahat. Mabuhay.
For this inaugural lecture of the Introducing South Asia series, we are honored to have Professor Rina Marwa as our guest speaker. Dr. Rina Marwa is a professor at the Jesus and Mary College, University of Delhi, New Delhi, India, where she has been teaching international business and politics of globalization. From 2017 to 2019, Professor Marwa was a senior fellow at the Indian Council of Social Science Research, Ministry of Human Resource Development, now Ministry of Education. She also served as senior academic consultant for the ICSSR, for the Indian Ministry of Human Resource Development from 2012 to 2018. She also led the India-Europe Research Platform, comprising 10 research councils of Europe until 2017 on behalf of ICSSR. Professor Marwa is the recipient of several prestigious fellowships, including the McNamara Fellowship of the World Bank in 1999-2000, and the Asia Fellowship of the Asian Scholarship Foundation in 2002-2003. She is also a senior fellow of the Institute of National Security Studies, Sri Lanka. She is also the founding editor of Millennial Asia, a triannual journal on Asian studies of the Association of Asia Scholars, published by Sage Publishers. Among her research interests are international relations, issues of China, Vietnam, Philippines, Thailand, and India, and development issues of South and Southeast Asia. Her most recent works are Reimagining India-Thailand Relations, a multilateral and bilateral perspective, China's economic footprint in South and Southeast Asia, a futuristic perspective, India-Vietnam relations, development dynamics and strategic alignment, and most recently, China and the Indo-Pacific, maneuvers and manifestations. Let's all give a welcome applause for Dr. Marwa.
Sorry, I have to say next.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much to the Asian Center for having me here today. It's really wonderful to see so many eminent scholars. I'm grateful to Dean, Professor Sevilla. I'm also grateful to so many friends who are here, and ambassadors, excellencies. Thank you for joining. So I'll be speaking about the rise of the Indo-Pacific, and the presentation is, I think you need to move that, please. Yes, rise of the Indo-Pacific, China's rise and the Belt and Road Initiative, the IPEF, ASEAN centrality, then US-China contestation, and what is expected in the future. Next, please. The origins of the Indo-Pacific and Asia-Pacific. As you know, that the Indo-Pacific is a much later term, which has actually got institutionalized more since 2021. And of course, it's moving pretty fast beyond that. And the Asia-Pacific, which has been the nomenclature and which still many countries subscribe to, including China, has been very hesitant to accept the term Indo-Pacific. It was only in 2021 that it finally accepted the idea of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And it still prefers to use the term Asia-Pacific wherever possible. And we have seen how it was actually, the harbinger was in the form of the Quad, which came together post the tsunami of 2004. And when these four countries came together by 2007, and that was the time when former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had mentioned the confluence of the two oceans, and bringing together the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean as very, very important maritime connected spaces, which needed to be viewed as a whole, affecting not only small countries, not only bringing in ASEAN, but also bringing in some of the major powers. And that is how actually over a period of time, the US-China rivalry has also built up. The Quad has, of course, got institutionalized. And even though it is known as an informal kind of grouping, but we do know that the 4 foreign ministers have been together even at the Raisina dialogue just 3 days ago in New Delhi. So no opportunity is being missed for these foreign ministers or these countries to come together at international forum like the G20, where they are again said to be engaging in deliberations, stating again that the Quad is not considered as a formal military alliance, but it is meant for several other things, and that the Quad and the Indo-Pacific are actually complementary to each other, and they are not exclusive of each other. Next, please. So when we say that, how the China-US rivalry began, and it's been there, of course, ever since President Trump kind of initiated that attack on China and did not want that the United States should be, be free-ridden on, countries should not accept that. And of course, as far as the Indian Ocean space is concerned, we know that there again, the rivalry has been playing out in a very, very significant way. India has, stated on several occasions that there is the string of pearls, which has been going around in China, deliberately building all kinds of assets, strategic assets in India's vicinity, which also impact India's sovereignty, because there are several projects to that effect. And in recent years, we've seen also how the Hambantota project is turning out to be more military because the Chinese ships are constantly sailing in the Indian Ocean. And that is why India is still towards the United States, as well as the other powers in Quad. That has been a great motivation, because in fact, all the 4 countries, possibly the US a little less, were very, very sensitive of irritating China when they came together in the Quad into 2017. India had been very sensitive before that, so had Australia, and even Japan had been sensitive. But in 2017, things changed, of course, with Mr. Trump's, looking towards the Indo-Pacific and kind of challenging China. Also 2017, at the same time, India had this skirmishes in June when we had the Doklam crisis that was happening. And beyond that, as you know, that post-Doklam, there's been Galwan Valley clashes as well in 2020, which led to a complete deterioration in in India-China relations. Sino-India relations really nosedived after the 20 Indian soldiers were killed in June 2020. And then in 2022, we also had the Tawang border clashes. And India is also building up infrastructure, and with the US also having various kinds of military and air exercises. We also know that China has been very, very wary about the Malacca Strait, the Malacca dilemma, and that has ensured that China also keeps its options open, and therefore it is seen as aggressing in the waters, whereas earlier China's vision of the maritime was limited, but over recent years, and especially under Xi Jinping, with the Belt and Road Initiative projects, spanning over 100 countries, and many of these are smaller countries which are, becoming more and more dependent on China. There has been this kind of emphasis by China to, put its footprint wherever it can, and therefore from Gwadar to Hambantota to several other ports. So China's rise, if we look at it, of course, it's the 1997 East Asian financial crisis. Next, please. Next, please. Yeah. So 1997 Asian financial crisis, when China had emerged as a great friend and economic partner of ASEAN. Post that, of course, 2001, China's joining the WTO led to a sea change in the way China emerged as a factory of the world. Then again, 2008, the global economic slowdown, which came alongside the Beijing Olympics of 2008 as well. And that was the time when Beijing engendered closer partnerships, even with major US allies like Australia, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, making the US really understand how the equations of China were changing. And that was the time when China was, of course, looked upon as a kind of dependent partner, as an emerging economic powerhouse. And then, of course, we had 2013 President Xi Jinping initially doling out a lot of money for infrastructure projects, which were highly welcomed by smaller Asian countries, and both in South and Southeast Asia, considered to be benign projects which were coming with aid and grants, which were really not tied. So untied grants, which all countries, sort of accept very willingly. And then, of course, as I said, Trump's America First policy and US abandoning its world leadership, including the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that actually led to conceding space for China, which started to dominate the multilateral trade agreements. And we know that how with ASEAN countries also, China has an overall trade agreement, but it also has the bilateral documents which are attached to the overall multilateral treaty, which also defines how China engages with each of these countries. Then further, China's economic footprint expands, and the RCEP is signed without India, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And then 2020, the pandemic saw China's wolf warrior diplomacy coming out in great, all the ambassadors in all the countries were kind of exhibiting this. And we know how Australia was impacted when it called for an independent kind of independent survey of the Wuhan virus and its initiation. And then we have China come up with the Community of Shared Future of Humankind and at the conceptual level. And of course, the BRI continued. Then we come to the IP, the Indo-Pacific, 13 countries which have joined, 13 economies. These have joined the IPEF. From Vietnam, we have 7 countries in Southeast Asia which have joined. Please, next slide. Yeah. So these countries agreed to join the IPEF, and the amount of trade between each of them and China, of course, is well known. China remains one of the largest partners for these countries. But again, here we find that ASEAN 7 nations have come directly impacted with China because of having aligned with the United States in this particular framework. The 4 pillars under IPEF, they are, of course, trade, supply chains, clean economy, and fair economy. So in the while the ASEAN countries have all joined the 4 pillars under IPEF, India has joined only 3. India has here also not joined the pillar of trade, that is resilient, sustainable, and inclusive growth, because some of the standards, labor standards and environmental protection, etc., are not very, very clear to India. And on the trade issues, India has been, in fact, even the ASEAN-India Free Trade Agreement is still being reviewed So because India has been having a deficit in trade with some of the ASEAN countries, India is reluctant to go ahead with the trade pillar, but the other three pillars are, of course, India is on board. When we compare the 2021 data, next slide, please. The data of China-US trade with ASEAN members in the IPEF for 2021, again, we find that all these 7 countries have much higher trade with China in comparison to the United States. So this kind of economic dependence is very much visible, and China knows that it is very much aware of this, and it will leverage it at any point, as it has done with other countries in the past, even one time with the Philippines. So each of the countries, and we can see that even in the case of the Philippines, it's 3 times the trade, the bilateral trade. And therefore, this dependence, economic dependence, remains large, and the United States needs to do really much more. We also know that the kind of contestation that is happening, we know that very few states really recognize Taipei, but of course, there are still a few states who do recognize Taipei. Taipei is becoming a huge flashpoint, and China has all control over the undersea cables. So one expert has been heard saying that, the minute they can just de-link the communication underground cables with Taipei, it's going to be extremely difficult. And we know that how the warships are sailing, even India is sailing warships now in the South China Sea, East Philippine Sea, East Vietnam Sea. So we know that, the kind of skirmishes which are there in the South China Sea, not only are the official vessels which are challenging the navies, the formal navies, but we also know how there are so many levels of militia ships. And recently I read that there are 40 militia ships which are already challenging the island of Palawan in the Philippines. So this is happening all the time. It's happening near Vietnamese, spaces. And we also know how the arbitration, the legal side had been kind of, stalled by President Duterte. So again, the issue is really a huge challenge. So Chinese and US forces could clash over Taiwan. And we know that the ones in yellow, I don't know if you can see them, but those are the Chinese military headquarters. There are US bases, and US is only trying to increase bases. So whether you call them locations in the Philippines or you call them bases, but there is bound to be much more engagement, much more, several more boots on the ground. And in fact, I just heard from one expert 2 days ago that meetings with soldiers, with US soldiers, are getting more and more now, getting scheduled on several occasions. You have groups of soldiers being formally trained and provided access to all these bases. So Philippines, of course, comes directly in that context, and that is why Philippines' own defense budget and security, cyber security, needs to also be beefed up, because that's important again. India and USA are elevating its partnership in several ways. On the very recent, partnership that has emerged is the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technology, which is going to look at intelligence surveillance. It's going to look at research and development cooperation. And it's also launching an innovation bridge that will connect US and Indian defense startups. But essentially, this is being viewed as a strategic part of the strategic partnership. So it's not just economic, but the real crux of the partnership is highly strategic. ASEAN centrality, we know, is the cornerstone of the Indo-Pacific strategies and engagements. India had a special India-ASEAN summit in October 2021. India has been also engaging a lot in the Indian Ocean. Recently, just last month, our defense minister was in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So we are trying to improve and beef up our security in the islands. Again, that is being, as in response to the threat from China. And in fact, for the first time, we also ventured ahead to name 21 islands of the Andaman and Nicobar space, which, as you know, one of the islands is only a few, less than 100 nautical miles from Sumatra in Indonesia. So our Act East policy, our IPOI and AOIP, we organized a conference in September on the overlap, and Professor Santarita has already contributed a paper for that, and Professor Tina as well. So for this conference, it brought out very clearly that how India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative has a lot of commonality with AOIP, and there is a shared vision, and Indonesia is already on board as far as the maritime security aspect is concerned. And in fact, there are not just one, there are 21 points of common interest. So the matrices resonate with Quad's initiatives because the ROK's new Southern policy, Indonesia's strategic plan for Asia Pacific, holistic maritime security capacities and capabilities. The US IP strategy of 2021 also endorses ASEAN centrality and also provides opportunities for Quad and ASEAN to work together. The French Indo-Pacific Strategy 2022 also recognizes the essential role of ASEAN, and all these countries are very keen that ASEAN centrality continues as a force, because that provides greater scope for not only providing ASEAN with greater security, but also for ASEAN to build relations with these countries. I would like to share a few highlights from the latest Institute of Southeast Asian Studies survey, which is done every year, and it's considered quite a reliable source of information. So May 22, US launched Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. 46.5% of Southeast Asians view the IPEF favorably for their countries, while only 11.7% perceive it negatively. 41.8% not yet sure about the impact. Among ASEAN IPF countries, the perceived positive impact is largest in Brunei, followed by Philippines and Vietnam. China saw a significant reduction in confidence even from Cambodia and Laos. Cambodia and Laos, as you know, have always been very, very sensitive of their neighbor. But now the things are changing, and even Cambodia and Laos are willing to denounce Chinese aggression. The region is worried about China's growing influence, regional and strategic influence, though the extent of wariness has decreased over the past 2 years. Then we have, similar to past trends, respondents welcomed ASEAN's and the US's growing regional political and strategic influence. So the acceptance of US political influence in the region has grown from 21 and 22, looking at US as a more reliable partner. Respondents are also cautious about ASEAN twofold increase and US increase, political and strategic influence in their countries, but that's a relatively small figure. US-China contestation, 50.4% of respondents agree or strongly agree that strengthening of this minilateral group will be constructive for the region. That means that the Quad is being considered as being constructive. The largest group of Southeast Asians, that is 37.8 from Indonesia and Vietnam, feel that cooperation with the Quad will be complementary to ASEAN efforts. 10.4% believe that Quad will force countries to choose sides, while 6.8% perceive that the Quad will provoke China, supported mainly by respondents from Malaysia and Myanmar. Enhancing ASEAN's resilience and unity to fend off pressure from two major powers this option is more pronounced in Vietnam. It has increased from 2022 and the Philippines. So both Vietnam and the Philippines consider it highly important that they should increase their resilience. And that is why you can see that both the Philippines and Vietnam are engaging in acquiring various defense capabilities. Minister Rajnath Singh was there in Vietnam last June, and he had provided 6 Coast Guard ships. With the Philippines, as you know, also BrahMos missile deal is happening. The EU and Japan are leading positions for hedging against certain uncertainties of US-China strategic rivalry. So EU and Japan are the most favored. 43% almost chose the EU, followed by 26.6% for Japan. India was ranked last in 2022, but we have doubled our ratings from 5.1% to 11.3% because of the global initiatives that India has taken, and now, of course, emerged as a voice of the global South through the G20. And we saw even how, for the first time, Foreign Minister Lavrov and Anthony Blinken had a meeting on the sidelines of the G20 just a few days ago. Trust in China is down considerably. So where trust in China, as you can see, was 58% in 2022, it has declined to 49.8%. And the distrust levels, interestingly, are the highest in Myanmar, Vietnam, and Philippines, and also Indonesia, 58%. Thailand is 57%. Even in Singapore, it has declined. And of course, NATO also included in June 22, for the first time, it included China in its strategic concept. So what are the supportive pillars, and how can the US-China contestation be managed? So first is to address the relevance of ASEAN centrality, where there is Chinese influence, which is impacting ASEAN centrality. There should be space to cooperate with relative freedom, capacity and capability building, and extended Quad line of cooperation to try and quell the notion of Quad. So as I was just listening to how the Quad foreign ministers were engaging 3 days ago in Delhi at the Raisina dialogue, it was again and again reiterated by each of the foreign ministers that it should not be considered as a hard security dialogue. And we know how China has been viewing the Quad as an Asian NATO. And of course, its foreign minister also mentioned at one point that it would dissolve like the sea foam and it would not be able to last. So again, not choosing sides, but opting for beneficial options as addressing non-traditional threats, risks, and challenges, and the kind of challenges which can be seen together are, of course, climate change, global health, which needs cooperative frameworks, critical and emerging technologies, cyber security, space, maritime domain awareness, and humanitarian and disaster relief management. So these are the areas in which Quad is attempting to make progress, while at the same time ensuring that it does not become a typically military alliance, though of course it is not completely ruled out, because whenever security comes into play, then the overall kind of narrative changes. The future, so US-China continuing contestation, there are more reasons than one. It's not just trade, it's not just the stealing of the intellectual property rights. It's much more than that. And of course, the US 12 provinces have disallowed Chinese to actually buy land in 12 provinces in the US. We also find that Chinese researchers are not being allowed in several institutions. Even in universities, what I find is that the US universities are making a beeline for Indian students, offering them all kinds of scholarships because they want the number of Chinese to actually decline. So from Taiwan to South China Sea to Korea, so strengthen ASEAN, that's very, very important. Of course, China is not yet a superpower the way the United States is, because for several reasons, and this has been articulated by various experts, that though China is a regional power, it is not yet a superpower in that sense of the term as the United States is, because the kind of influence that it has, the kind of basis that it has. The US can sail its ships anywhere in any of the seas, and it has bases all over, whereas China has, literally or formally, it has one base. So it still needs to leapfrog the geopolitical constraints of its home region. And the kind of axis that is emerging now is the China, Russia, Iran axis, which of course countries have to understand. Link projects, workable strategies across the common areas, and interoperability, maritime exercises, and more of these are happening now. We also know that minilaterals are alternate to direct Quad alignment, Australia, India, Indonesia, or Japan, Vietnam, India, where there are connectivity projects, specific issues to be addressed, more flexible and functional, start at track 1.5 levels and to move up. And from the Indian perspective, it hopes that ASEAN countries will come on board initiatives like the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure and the IPOI, that is Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. So the future really is that we need to come together in so many ways, and the contestation is not going to sort of die down. The contestation is only growing, and it is reason for all of us to be worried and to act collectively. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rina. Let me now introduce our two discussants. Our first discussant is Herman Joseph Kraft, professor and former chair of the Department of Political Science at UP Diliman. He is also currently the convener of the Strategic Studies Program of the Center for Integrative and Development Studies here at UP. He has written on issues concerning ASEAN, regional security in Southeast Asia, security sector reform, and interstate conflict in the Philippines. Our second discussant is Matthew Santamaria, who is professor and the assistant to the Dean for Cultural Affairs at the UP Asian Center. He obtained his Doctor of Law in Political Science at Kyoto University. Dr. Santamaria is also an artist and does performance and cultural studies. He handles courses in sociocultural courses in Asian Studies and Philippine Studies here at Asian Center. So may we call on Professor Kraft?
Okay. Allow me to start with a statement of thanks for being invited to actually be part of this gathering. When Tina actually asked me to be one of the discussants here, they said that they needed somebody who would actually be responding to the geopolitical side of the discussion. It behooves me to say that, you know, if I'm the only choice that people actually have for geopolitics, then I think we're in trouble. But the second point is I'd like to congratulate Dr. Marwa about her presentation. It's rare that we actually see a South Asian perspective here at the University of the Philippines. Usually we talk about the Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific, but it's really more of ASEAN, China. You know, it's east of the Malacca Strait, basically, that we tend to talk about. And so, hearing somebody talk about a perspective from South Asia is actually something that's, I'm not sure if it's refreshing, but at least we get a different perspective, so to speak. I do not have much time. I was given 10 minutes to actually make my remarks, and so I'm just going to limit myself to maybe making 5 or 6 points, all coming from the talk that Dr. Marwa actually gave us. Number one is the point that I think that struck me was she started things with a talk on names, right? Names matter, okay? The idea of the differentiation between the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific might simply be a matter of nomenclature, you know, or semantics, but it's important because I think one point that she made in talking about the differentiation between the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific is the question of inclusivity and exclusivity, right? The idea that when we insist on talking about this as the Asia-Pacific region, implies the notion of excluding certain countries in the discussion, right? And their interests tend to be ignored as far as that discussion is actually concerned. Whereas extending it to talk about the Indo-Pacific means that there's a greater set of interests that become part of this region. It's not just geography, so to speak, that we're talking about, but what that the geography actually implies in terms of who are your players, what interests are actually involved, and therefore what kind of interaction we're going to expect. But that's important precisely because of the second point. The discussion of Dr. Marwa actually cuts across 2 main points, okay? And it goes back to a description of the Indo-Pacific. On one hand, okay, is that it's a region of cooperation, meaning to say we're seeing multilateral arrangements actually being set up. A number of economic agreements are actually being organized. The RCEP, IPEF, and so on. Okay, and so in that context, we see that the geopolitics of the region actually implies or includes a significant part of cooperation actually taking place, right? And the cooperation is seen largely in terms of expanding economic relations, and trying to institutionalize the kind of cooperation that actually takes place. On the other hand, right, and this is where I think things become a little bit clammy in terms of the situation. It's a region of contention, right? Dominated largely by the relationship between the United States and China. And I think across the discussion of Dr. Marwa, we could get a sense of the importance and significance of that competition. In fact, one could make the argument, right, that just taking a step back, talking about the cooperative arrangements, for instance, we're supposed to be in the Asian century, as far as the international political economy is actually concerned. The projections made by ADB, by the World Bank, shows that by 2050, as much as 50% of the world's population will be located in this region, right? And the same number approximately would be the share of the world's GDP being located again in this region. So in other words, there's a lot of dynamism that's actually going on economically, okay? And that's why the importance of that drive for cooperation. But like I said, the other side of the coin, and I'm not sure if I could describe it as tension, or just two parallel tracks, basically, it's going on within the region, right? Is of course the idea of being a region of contention, like I said, driven by, or at least overlaid by the competition between China and the United States. Okay, this is important precisely because of I think the question of maintaining peace. Something that Dr. Mar was actually talking about. About this issue actually becoming a problem and needing to be managed in some way. So just to emphasize the point, two contending shall we say tensions, if you will, that we have to actually observe, as far as the kinds of relationships that we're actually looking at, in the Indo-Pacific. The third point here addresses precisely those tensions. In fact, arguably, both geographically and institutionally, was the reference to ASEAN centrality, right? ASEAN as a center of cooperation, right? And ASEAN also as, if we're talking about it geographically, as a region where the competition between China and the United States, is most highly visible, both, ironically, both in terms of the competition between China and the United States and the competing arrangements, that both are actually trying to establish. One point that struck me, was that from the idea of the importance of ASEAN centrality, especially in terms of looking at it as something that could actually manage or help manage, the US-China contention, is the reference, to minilaterals becoming more and more important. I'm actually curious about this movement, in terms of the discussion from the multilateralism of ASEAN, to the minilaterals. To me, the minilaterals actually, I might be wrong, but to me it represents a weakness in ASEAN and ASEAN centrality, right? That the reason why we have minilaterals is because ASEAN centrality has proven to be inadequate, as far as some of the geopolitical issues are actually concerned. Okay, ASEAN centrality has been defined largely in terms of, well, to be crude about it, the ability of ASEAN to host parties, basically, right? Meaning to say that one way of looking at ASEAN centrality, and I think it's the most popular way of looking at it. It's the one given by Meli Caballero Anthony, wherein ASEAN is supposed to be the hub for meetings, the hub for getting countries in the region actually together, right? But precisely, I think you have minilaterals because that way of looking at ASEAN and ASEAN centrality is inadequate as far as as far as trying to manage the relationship between China and the United States actually concerned. In other words, we're facing a situation where we're looking for, and this is important because when Dr. Marwa talked about the future, right? This is basically what it is all about. No, what is it that we can do, that can be done in order to actually manage the overarching importance and influence of the competition between China and the United States. Even in terms of cooperation, there's competitive cooperation that's going on with both China and the United States actually forming their respective blocks, trying to organize their respective trade arrangements. RCEP IPEF on the part of the United States, for instance, with RCEP and the BRI on the part of China being seen as countervailing arrangements led by both okay, since Dr. Marwa's been precise in terms of defining a superpower, I'll just talk about the leading powers within the region, so to speak. Okay, and then and going back to the last set of points, the discussion on the future, right? What does the future look like? And we can see that it's not a very optimistic picture that she actually paints. On one hand, you still have the contestation between China and the United States. In the short, over the short, maybe medium term, depends on how much the contestation actually plays out. Continuing to be the dominant relationship as far as the region is actually concerned. And I think Dr. Marwa was quite optimistic in a way that I'm not about ASEAN. Okay, where she talks about the idea of strengthening ASEAN, trying to use ASEAN as some sort of bulwark that would put a wedge between the intensifying competition or put a wedge into the intensifying competition between the United States and China. I think a key component here is not to look at ASEAN as a collective player, but the key component here is to what extent can ASEAN actually stay together, in terms of trying to play that role. I think part of the problem is that ASEAN is too divided, both in terms of its external relations, particularly in terms of its external relations, and even internally, right? It can't even resolve the Myanmar issue, for instance. So I find I'm less optimistic about the role that ASEAN can actually play as far as this geopolitical picture is actually concerned. But I think there are a number of things that we have to seriously consider here. And I agree with Dr. Marwa that I think we will still see continued movements towards minilaterals as a number of issues actually arise, which multilateral arrangements are not able to actually resolve simply because of too many players being in some of this. So we'll see a lot of alignments of like-minded countries on specific issue areas. But this means the point that she made regarding linking projects and workable strategies, which I would actually say would probably be something that would see different alignments across different kinds of issue areas. The dominance of the China-US relationship would mean that most of the alignments will be all about this particular relationship. But this relationship doesn't actually, or there are certain issue areas which might be low-hanging fruits, HADR, as was mentioned earlier on, is an example. No, where cooperation might mean alignments, no, across countries with similar or at least converging interests, no, on specific issue areas. No, but Dr. Marwa, congratulations. That was a great drawing of the region for us. No, while I hope your, should I say, optimism of how you see the region actually plays out, no, rather than my own very pessimistic notion of where we're headed. No, so thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. And this is indeed such a great honor and also a result of a very wonderful coincidence. The organizers actually didn't know how the three of us are entangled together. Hercraft is my sort. No, I will not say anything bad. Hercraft is my sort of a cohort in the political science department. We joined the political science department a long, long time ago, the medieval period in the 1980s. Yes, and of course, Romel Banlawi was also one of our classmates. and Rina and I were together in the Asian Scholarship Foundation, and for the three of us to be here talking about Indo-Pacific is quite interesting. And as Professor Kraft would say, if we are in trouble, because why is he in here in this discussion? And we're really in trouble. Why am I here? But the organizer said that I'm supposed to bring in a cultural perspective, or as the Filipinos would say, cultural perspective. And in that manner, I think I will simply add on to the things that that Rina had said, because if we take a look at the beginning of her presentation, yes, names are really quite important. And I asked the question, what were we before we became Indo-Pacific? Now, in this part of the world, from the Chinese perspective, we were Nanyang, or from the Japanese perspective, Nanyeo, the southern seas. South of what? South of China. So that is the perspective of the scholar or the power that coined the term. Later on, we would become East Indies. Okay, so we were an extension of India. The East Indies, probably a British perspective. We also have the West Indies. But while Nanyeo and East Indies were existing and came much later, to many of the people living in the region, we were simply Nusantara, no? The islands and land and seas in between. Yeah, so we already have an idea of what we are, the islands and the seas. So I think going to the concept of Indo-Pacific, I think it shifts us again to a perspective of looking at ocean basins and how these ocean basins are connected to each other. And if you have that big map in your mind right now, they are connected to each other by the centrality of Southeast Asia. Yeah. And of course, we have a small sliver of space there called the South China Sea, which we prefer to call the West Philippine Sea. So yes, the concepts are interesting because they do give us that sense of importance that we belong to a maritime world, that this maritime world share peoples, resources, political challenges, and yes, natural disasters. No? And we have not even gone into the bigger, much bigger challenge to us as a species. No? We are actually polluting the oceans with a lot of our plastics, including the plastics promoted by our own politicians who are plastics themselves. So, I begin with that comic, if not pessimistic view, but I think I will try to agree with you with your optimistic view of ASEAN, because I think ASEAN is developing so much faster than we think of. During my time, we don't even mention integration, right, Professor Kraft? Now we can now mention integration, but probably we will not hope for that until after 50 years of our retirement, which comes in 2030 for you and 2031 for me, I believe, no? I believe, yeah? Okay, and I hope we will be professors emeriti by that time, okay? Okay, so moving on, okay, where am I? Okay. Moving on now. Yes, the cultural perspective. We look back into history, we see this as a zone of cultural encounter. These ocean worlds, the Pacific as well as the Indian Ocean, are worlds of exchange. Yes, they are worlds of exchange. Sometimes they are worlds of conquest. Yes, they are worlds of trade, but they are also worlds of missionary work, and they are worlds of cultural encounter. And that's because the oceans do not divide. They actually connect communities together. They are much easier to breach than big mountains. And that's why whenever you have coastal regions, coastal communities in these oceanic worlds, you will see a lot of interconnections. And one very good example of this is the journey of the epic, the Ramayana. You know? We see that the Ramayana just went east and a little bit west, and it went throughout the rest of Asia without any government support. No? It went on its own. It went on its own. Maybe just like Rama. No? It just went, we'll not call it an exile, it went on a journey, ayana. No? So the two ocean worlds should also be seen as a zone of culture. And this zone of culture can be seen as a zone of cultural cooperation or a zone of cultural conflict. And the conflict can be seen in terms of very, very bad conflict, but it can also mean competition. If we take a look at Southeast Asia right now, 3 cultural cores compete for the minds of Southeast Asians. The Philippines, well entrenched in Hollywood, right? And I see a lot of nodding heads. Yes, we are very much entrenched in Hollywood. Yeah, and I was about to mention that. No, but we also have Hong Kong, Shaolin, and Kung Fu movies, right? And we also have Bollywood. So if we see all of the, in the IR theories, you know, all of these zero-sum games and all of these models, yes, we do see power being directed in our seas and our oceans, but we hardly talk about the world of culture. We do every now and then when we discuss this thing called soft power, and that is where K-pop comes in. And you see from such a small nation, no, divided nation, in fact, the North and the South, the Southern K-pop has basically conquered the world. And it has basically conquered the mind of Dr. Natividad. No? She's a very, very, very good K-pop enthusiast, and we're waiting for her magnum opus on the K-pop. So, and if we take a look also at Southeast Asia, we see enclaves of culture, enclaves of the overseas Chinese, and they have their own identities. Peranakan or Parianon, no? They are from China, but have gone down with no government policy whatsoever. They just moved down south, and now they see themselves in the Straits as well as in the Philippines. Binondo is supposed to be the oldest Chinatown in the world. The Davao City Chinatown supposed to be the biggest Chinatown in the world. I don't know why we love these superlatives. And of course, the more beautiful Chinatowns of Georgetown and even in Malacca. We see a huge community, and that's why we have cultures from other civilizations coming to the region and establishing themselves in the region, forming communities and forming new identities. So the two oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, are zones of culture and zones of identity formation. So that's another way of looking at it. Now, from missionary point of view, and I have to say this, the missionaries love looking at the maps like we all do, except that they don't see it like IR or strategies. They look at it as how many churches have been built there. No? And we see in the Philippines, my goodness, the Korean Presbyterians have built so many churches in the Philippines. We only see K-pop, but actually the Koreans are here saving souls in the Philippines. And I find it ironic because we're supposed to be the country that is at one point the sole Christian country in Asia. I don't know if that is still correct, no? With Timor being there, no? And of course, Korea also quite Christian in percentage of its population. So that's another way of looking at it. And when we take a look at the Indo-Pacific as a zone of culture, of encounter, of collaboration, of conflict in terms of culture, then we see a different way of looking at things. Here at the Asian Center, we have a China, what is the name of our room over there? China Book Center, no? And we also have a Confucius Institute, right? And we also have in the Ateneo a Confucius Institute, but we do not see a Tagore Institute, for instance. No? So what am I trying to drive at? I'm trying to drive at that we have the Confucius Institute, and oh, by the way, we have the Japan Foundation here. Welcome, yokoso, irashaimase. Okay, and thank you for coming. It's also a zone for cultural influence building because we are trying to influence each other through our cultural production and through our respective cultural consumption. And that's why the Japan Foundation's work, Confucius Institute's work, Goethe Institute, the British Council, they are all important parts of these culture zones. And they can be seen in a competitive sense or in a collaborative sense. Now, when you take a look at these two regions, we see three very important models of governance. Of course, the Filipinos would always look to America, the American type of democracy, the federal type of presidential form of governance. In India, we see the world's biggest democracy. Oh my goodness, I've always heard about how they manage elections in India, and somehow they can actually tell you the results after a week. No? In the Philippines, we manage elections and we can tell you the results in 3 months, the world record. No? But India is the biggest federal form of democracy. And that is one cultural model to follow. And in the middle, we have China. I'll repeat that. In the middle, since it is the Middle Kingdom, we have China. And since I am not a sinologist, I will end my commentary there. But I will just add a footnote that it is another model of governance. And this is where soft power now works. And that's why we need to take culture very, very importantly, because from these cultural properties and from these cultural products we consume, we actually form our perspectives of the world. And it is very refreshing indeed that Rina tells us that ASEAN is central, because many political scientists say ASEAN is not central at all, cannot do anything. And I understand my colleague's pessimism, because he has been looking at ASEAN for a long, long time. But at the same time, if we look at the record of ASEAN, if you look at the record of ASEAN, and we look at the record of the region has done so-so, not that bad, no? We have not killed each other, Herman. Not yet, no, not yet, okay. But we have not killed each other. We have actually developed a process of functional peace, or at least a way of avoiding war. I end here. I stress the idea of looking at the two ocean basins as cultural zones apart from zones of political conflict. Thank you very much.
Okay, maraming salamat kay Herman and Matthew. And thank you for the wonderful presentations from our three speakers. When we were planning this roundtable, we purposely decided to keep the number of participants small because we wanted to have a real discussion. And since we're talking about oceans and seas and waters, let's dive in. So can we have views, comments from the floor or from the round table? And please introduce say your name and affiliation when you speak. So we have Dr. Sabrichea.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your very enlightening presentation. You really showed us the very conflicting stand now that we have. While we want to have an ASEAN that is free from Western influences, we're also so dependent on the support given by big powers. My question now really comes from a very personal narrative, because some of our department officials have been asking me, and I could not make any comment. What would be the implications? We are talking about China and the very strong presence now of China, which pose some serious threats to our country in particular and many ASEAN region. The question that my students have been asking me, and I cannot answer it, so may I ask you to give your comments, is the implication now of Ukraine and Russia and the possible threat of China's participation in this nuclear war. What is your reading on it?
Thank you for your question. Yeah. So just 2 or 3 points here. First, of course, some countries in ASEAN are more vulnerable to Chinese aggression, and they are facing it all the time, from Scarborough Show 2012 and beyond. And you are dealing with it in your own way by beefing up your deterrence capabilities and improving on your defense capabilities as well. The second is, as far as the Ukraine war, certainly all countries are impacted. And the Philippines, Vietnam, India, every country is impacted. So not only issues of food security, but also prices, fuel prices, energy prices. We are all directly impacted by that. Regarding your point about China using its nuclear facilities, capabilities, along with Russia, that is why the United States and the Western powers are constantly engaged in providing Ukraine with all the help that they can. At least they are constantly committing to that. And because it has to be noted that unless the Western powers can support Ukraine, it will give an impetus to countries like China to also go the Russian way. So it has to be stopped at all costs. And that is why, whether it is, side kind of conversations, as we saw happening at G20 between Anthony Blinken and Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia, that the international community is very, very concerned. And that's why meetings and everything is continuing, because China has to be restrained. And that is what China does. It watches, that the fact that Russia has antagonized Ukraine and has entered, and its aggression is manifest in so many ways that Bakhmut is almost falling now, which is again very, very serious. So China is actually watching to what extent Russian sanctions on Russia are working, and to the extent that Russia can be successful, and also like what kind of losses Russia is going to have. So China is very carefully studying that. And its own historical relationship with Russia, as we also know, is not one of friends. So they are more like, out of necessity or whatever, because there are so many countries against China, so many against Russia now, that they have very few choices. But through history, through Mao's time, we know that China never considered Russia as a Soviet Union as a reliable partner.
Thank you very much. Yeah. And then we'll go back to this side.
Hello, I'm Satya Sultana. I did my PhD from China, Beijing. Before that, I did my master's from US and now living in Philippines. So very strategic student. So yeah, jokes apart, just like to make two remarks. So starting from the word entanglement. So my question is whether we take the word as to compromise or complicate the issue more. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, if you want to look more positively, involvement is more preferred than entanglement. But I believe in, this issue can keep on going if we don't follow or if we don't comply with the international laws, particularly international arbitration. Because this goes back to my saying of the South China Sea issue, because my background is international business, so can't avoid the South China Sea problem. So maritime trade, is the focus of the whole Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific, strategy, if you like. So that issue has to be, in line with international law. Okay, so that is the first point. And then the ASEAN viewpoints should be respected, because the ASEAN itself is an institution and they prefer, the unity rather than being at the cornerstone or the center of this hegemony or the power-led contest, if you like, between the US and China. So because, a couple of jargons have been used, so I just would like to mention that. One is like like-minded democracies. So that's very important because the whole idea of Indo-Pacific started with this background that there would be like-minded democracies. And ASEAN could not be excluded because it's in the heart of that strategy. And then there is another dialogue partners, which I really like this your analogy. So dialogue partners is like ASEAN, they want an inclusive and institutionalized regionalism. Okay, rather than United States, to exclude US or to support China, not taking any sides, just like a dialogue partner, maintaining its unity and then keeping maritime trade and peaceful navigation, at its objective. So because the whole idea of Indo-Pacific, the strategy is about geopoliticalism and infrastructure. So obviously South China Sea and other maritime trades come in picture. So unless we resolve these issues, this can complicate more, entangle more. So instead of that, all ASEAN countries can get involved and see how best they can do it. So the most important thing here is the peaceful resolution of dispute. Okay, the peaceful resolution of dispute settlements where arbitration comes into picture, then stability, of course, freedom of navigation, and the neutrality over question of sovereignty, very, very important. And then respect of maritime norms. So these are, the overall objective. Not taking a side of any particular country, but overall. So after this, talk and hearing our learned professors, so I think like these are a couple of remarks I would like to touch base on international law, as well as keeping the objective intact instead of going into power contest, for Pacific. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Let's hear from Jaime Naval.
Good afternoon. So many questions and insights roused by the presentation and the discussion's point of view. I think I could stick to two. My mind goes LSS, like last song syndrome, from ASEAN centrality and then this thing about like-minded democracies, which is actually contestable even as we discuss it. I remember I was teaching Southeast Asia and what happens, for example, in Vietnam, and is there really freedom in Vietnam as a case in point? And I remember one leading police official in Vietnam said that there's freedom of expression in Vietnam. And he says that there's clearly freedom of expression in Vietnam, but you have to be prepared. There's no freedom after the expression. So you have to run away and hide. The first point I really want to bring out, or even ask our presenter, Dr. Marwa, is the idea of ASEAN centrality. This is, I think I'm in the same league as my two colleagues who were discussants, where I'm uncomfortable with every time this issue about ASEAN centrality is brought out, because there's so much responsibility that is attendant to this concept. When it's mentioned, I look at and questions and images are triggered in my mind. Is it a stature that ASEAN has attained that every time ASEAN is brought into the picture or is intended to be invited, we have to make it a co-chair, or it's something that it's entitled to, like it's being ex officio? Or is it an achievement? Okay, we've done this, been there, done that, so what's next? Is it an entitlement? It's not only a right, but it's a privilege. Or have we become used to ASEAN centrality as a fixture? It's just a trophy that we had before, but what do we do now? Is it an earned right? Or is it not that it should be a continuing initiative? Something that you work, because not only you've proven it in the past, you continue to prove it in the present and in the future. Because this is not a diplomatic forum, I feel very uncomfortable when ASEAN centrality is mentioned, because my idea is, boy, we should cover ourselves with masks when we remember Myanmar. We should be covering ourselves with a blanket when we discuss South China Sea. And I take note of the title, Entanglements. I'm wondering Indo-Pacific, then it's China and Southeast Asia billeted on the subtitle, but I think I could put it, yeah, we have a number of things entangled with between China and Southeast Asia. A case in point, for those who are not from ASEAN, maybe we collectively would have to examine what is really this ASEAN centrality as it has been in the past, and what's the trajectory that we want for it in the foreseeable future. I think there's more that we could do to really earn this and continue to assert that ASEAN should be right at the middle, or being a co-driver, or being a main factor for every discussion that involves our region as it is, or with other regions. I think it's a hype up thing if we don't do our part. I have a question related to one of the points that Dr. Marwa has pointed out, and I have to go beyond South China Sea. You mentioned, for example, the issue of that, let me just go through my notes. China will need to leapfrog the geopolitical constraints of its home region. Would you want to elaborate on that? What you mean leapfrogging geopolitical constraints of its region? But same, you mentioned continuing contestations would have to, we in the region, or China in particular, would have to watch out this continuing contestation, the SCS, the Taiwan, and Korea. I wonder if it's by deliberate, or you could have explained or elaborated. You did not include the East China Sea. I think it's an equally important region. And what happens in SCS or what happens in ECS would have implications on the other, vice versa. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
First, what you mentioned about ASEAN centrality. So I only want to say that in Asia and in South Asia, as you know, what has happened with SAARC. So we always try to compare SAARC with ASEAN. And then we feel that ASEAN's done really well. So it's a relative kind of understanding. And that is why we stress on it so much, because we still feel that, you know, at least all ASEAN leaders can sit around the same table. They can shake hands the ASEAN way. There is an ASEAN way of dealing and doing things, even if it is on the golf course, right? A lot of informal meetings. When I had interviewed people in Thailand, they told me that, I mean, ASEAN meets all the time, whether they're meeting over lunch or they're meeting at the golf course. They're, I mean, constantly engaged. There were 300 meetings happening a year, formal and informal ones. We want to see that in South Asia. We don't seem to make any headway. That's why we've gone to BIMSTEC. We've gone to BBIN. And there again, there are major hurdles even on movement of transportation. You even come to agreements about, you know, people working, mobile sort of mobility of professionals. We've reached nowhere. We can't even sit together and talk. So in that sense, you know, in Asia, ASEAN is showing the way in whatever way it is. Of course, we don't say that there are limitations, that there are no limitations. There are. But then we still accept that ASEAN has done well for itself ever since 1967. And amongst ASEAN countries, there was so much of dispute between Thailand and Malaysia, between Thailand and Cambodia. So you've been also had so many differences amongst yourself, but still you've got together. And you are together, right? Whatever limitations, because all 10 countries are so different, from Singapore to Laos. You look at the heterogeneity of all nations. So naturally you will have your, you know, countries under whose influence you are for whatever reasons. Yeah. And the second question you mentioned was about, sorry. Yeah, China leapfrogging, because if China is to be a superpower, it needs to do much more than kind of, you know, provide investments in other countries and then place them in debt burdens, which they cannot shake off. So China has still not assumed that kind of a position where the United States is. Because United States still has a huge major role as a democracy. And we know how China's kind of reputation and the kind of aggression which it has shown under Xi Jinping's rule and becoming president for life. I mean, these things, and now the way he's been clamping down the zero COVID policy, is that acceptable to its people? No. And why did they back out from the zero COVID policy? Because they didn't want protests. COVID could spread, but protests could not spread. So this whole thing, and there have been so many cases of people, the informal kinds of social media, the protests that have happened. But we also know that how the Shanghai clique is being completely mowed down, how the big businesses are completely being mowed down. So China has huge domestic issues. And in that sense, even its, military capabilities are still not matching with the United States. I don't know if that answers.
Okay, so in the interest of time, what I'll do is get two comments each time, and then we'll ask Dr. Marwa to respond. And we'll finish all the people whose name plates are up, and then we'll have to close the discussion. So we'll start with Professor Rennie. Short, and then Ambassador.
They're falling like timber. Yeah, I just three quick points. My name is John Rennie Short. I'm a Fulbright visiting professor from University of Maryland. I just one of the points I want to pick up at when you mention Ukraine. It's clear that if you're in Europe or North America, Ukraine has a larger resonance than this part of the world. You see the figures, it doesn't count all that large. India hasn't said much about it. I think it's probably beholden for me to say how important it is, not just for Europe, but for global geopolitics. It is a pivotal moment because it's resuscitated the notion of the West and NATO. And so for Europeans and North Americans, it reminds us of the same bombing pictures that Nazi Germany did. And there's that same sense you have to draw a line in the sand now. It really is that strong. And that has significance for this part of the world because it means a much harder line on China and a real sense of a pushback, not only from the US, but the other countries, and also in terms of tactics. Sanctions have been very powerful. Now, Russia and China are very different, but nevertheless, we've got smarter at using sanctions, and China will pay a huge economic price if it invades Taiwan. It may not bother them, but it will bother them when their population rises up, they can't get food. So that's at one point, that sense of like Ukraine shuddering effects all over the world, and especially here. And I think the second point I'd make about China leapfrogging, answering your question, you just need to read the Chinese, strategic documents. They want to push the line out, firstly, out the Southeast China Sea, and ultimately to the middle of the Pacific. They want strategic depth. It's clear as day. It's like reading German invasion plans in 1939. Of course, they're going to invade France. China is going to push out all the way to the mid-Pacific because it wants strategic depth. It wants to avoid American power. And so that's the main geographic leapfrog. And Philippines is just in the way in the sense, right? And the third point I make about ASEAN is useful. I mean, I don't want to be too critical. Since I'm an ASEAN Fulbright professor, it seemed like biting the hand that feeds you, right? But there's a sense that ASEAN is incredibly useful for its initial mission, which was to get countries together, like stop fighting about borders. And in some sense, it's been remarkably successful at that. You've had no border wars in this region, but theoretically, we know alliances for internal don't provide a good sort of platform for facing external threats. So I've taken up a lot of your time, and I really enjoyed your paper. So these are just random thoughts. So.
Actually, I did not want to raise my hand. I was forced by professor. But honestly, as I have raised my hand with my free will, of course, now. So I will be very brief because if we talk about quota, half of my quota has taken my fellow Sadia. So I will be very brief. I will make 2 points, remarks. If we talk about the rise of the Indo-Pacific, then we have to talk about IORA, Indian Ocean Rim Association. You see, this is an association comprising 22 members and 10 discussion partners, including USA and other big countries. And in addition to that, we need to discuss Big B. Madam Arina has very shortly touched upon Big B. It was initiated by former Prime Minister Abe of Japan. And also we have to study the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. So if we can make a comprehensive and comparative study of all these organizations, then we will have a clear picture of the rise of the Indo-Pacific. This was my first one. And the second one is about China and ASEAN. You see, China is a big economy now in the world. This is the second largest economy, just after USA. And people are hoping that very shortly, China will surpass US economy. So as a single entity, ASEAN can benefit immensely from China. This is the side of potentiality between China and ASEAN. But there is challenges because you have already, many of us have discussed about South China Sea. Professor has termed it West Philippine Sea. There is a problem, there is an issue, you know. In this regard, I would like to refer to Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Bangladesh, India maritime cases. We have issues with our big neighbor country, India, but we have resolved it through ITLOS in 2014. And we have got 20,000 square kilometers in the Bay of Bengal without any tussle, anything. We agreed upon the verdict given by ITLOS. The same way, we resolved our issues with our another neighboring country, Myanmar, maritime sovereignty over maritime territory. So, and the Bangladesh-Myanmar maritime dispute was the first case in the ITLOS. And these 2 cases very amicably settled through ITLOS. I think if as a single entity, ASEAN can negotiate with China on the issue of South China Sea, you have, I think you have 230 islands, reefs, cays in South China Sea, and some of them are disputed between Brunei, Vietnam, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, and China. So as a single entity, this is my personal views. If ASEAN can proceed with China, it is possible to resolve it easily. In addition, you have a verdict of ITLOS also, which was given in 2016. You can sit with China on the basis of that verdict. So it will be easier for you to come out from this kind of issues. And on this point, I would like to make another comment that even if there is issue will be there among the countries. You can keep the issues aside and you can move forward with other things like economic cooperation, political issues. You cannot sort it out within a moment. Keep it aside and you go ahead with our other cooperation. Thank you, Professor Rina, for your wonderful presentation, and Professor Herman and Professor Matthew for their discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's go from Don Gale, and then Dr. Rakisa.
Thank you very much. And
I'd like to give my greatest compliments to Dr. Marwaji for providing such a outstanding discussion on the Indo-Pacific. And on top of that, my area centers on India-Southeast Asian relations, where I wish to humbly provide a little bit of additional points towards this significant discussion. When we look into the Indo-Pacific geographically as an amalgamation of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, this is not new. In the mid-1800s, major powers have been incorporating both areas, both geographical spaces, as one geographical and geopolitical unit, one geopolitical region. Now, the Indo-Pacific represents two things primarily. One would be the fluctuation of power at the systemic level and the perceptions of these powers towards the current situation in international politics. Now, we talk about members of the Quad, for example, and they have different visions for the Indo-Pacific. The free and open Indo-Pacific of the US, Japan includes that, but also puts special emphasis on infrastructure development, particularly in West Asia, where it is already the top investor of infrastructure in Southeast Asia. So this complements its vision. India, on the other hand, rests on the notion of inclusivity, draws from our tradition of Vasudev Kutumbakam, which is one world is the world is our family. And this, of course, represents the inclusive nature of India's engagements within the Indo-Pacific. And of course, Southeast Asia maintains a significant place in India's foreign policy and position in the Indo-Pacific. Just very briefly, in fact, when China released, well, not Chinese government, but rather a significant think tank in China in 2013, 2014, entitled the Blue Book, it cleverly cited India's Look East policy as a precursor for China to really provide more and engage more assertively in the Indian Ocean. Well, of course, two perspectives differ significantly in terms of the perception towards established order. So India, Southeast Asia maintains significant growth in terms of multidimensional areas of cooperation. And this is significant as, of course, through the series of international issues and India's adherence to strategic autonomy, India has become more of a welcome player in the region, despite the fact that in the past, levels of relations were estranged to the point that there was lack of awareness towards both sides. Now, the last point I'd like to make, of course, would be the problems created, of course, by a rising China. In fact, ironically, the significance of the Indo-Pacific is tied with China's growing Belt and Road Initiative. And in fact, it is the Belt and Road Initiative that continues to constrain and, of course, tie both areas together. And in fact, China's Global Security Initiative, for that matter, also addresses its rejection for the US alliance system, more of an Asia for Asians approach as well. Now we have the BRI, of course. There is still a significant infrastructure gap in the Indo-Pacific. However, there is always opening for new players. However, unfortunately, the G7, for example, has been churning out projects after projects every G7 meeting, 4 or 5, but they have not materialized because of the limitations within the group. So if like-minded democratic powers of the Indo-Pacific would seek to harness a more collective approach towards providing value to the developing world in the Indo-Pacific, sustainable rules-based democratic-laden infrastructure development, this is the way to go. But then we have to iron out, of course, the differences and maintain practicality in order to advance a collective nature of engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and of course, the maintenance of the established rules-based order. Thank you very much.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. So I'll just actually the comment earlier, I'm just going to write on to it. I do want to take advantage of the fact that we have a Dr. Marwa here, who's from India. And the thing that I've been asking myself is, what does India bring to the table as far as when we're talking about India now becoming, there are reports that India may overtake China as an economic power. That's one. Second is that I'm still trying to figure out what India is going to be as far how will it exercise its power, given that it is a rising geopolitical player. So that's my question, what does India bring to the table?
So India, as Dawn just mentioned, believes in this one family, one future, and shared vision. So firstly, whenever our neighbors are in problem, we have reached out to them. Even with vaccines, more than 100 countries, we have supplied them with vaccines. And since last February, middle of February last year, all of India is without masks completely. And that's saying a huge thing for 1.4 billion people almost. We are becoming the #1 population. So as far as HADR operations are concerned, even right now, whether it was Turkey, it was our NDRF forces which were the first to reach there. And, any kind of from tsunami time, India has been immediately Nepal earthquake. There are n number of incidents where India has been first. With Sri Lanka, we already helped them in their economic crisis. Pakistan wants to improve relations with us because IMF is giving them a very hard time. And they've been asked to, tweak a lot of policies before they get any money. So, in various ways, I mean, soft power ways, and we are kind of beefing up our pharmaceutical industry even more. And as a huge investment destination for Southeast Asian countries, for, Korea, US. So India is being looked at as a very favorable destination for investments. And ease of business also, we are improving in that sense. So soft power, India has kind of stretched itself, and HADR operations. But even as otherwise, and as G20 is making out to be, whether it's financial inclusion, whether it's the UPI system, it has been adopted by Singapore. So our fintech is enormous. It's very well, it's got a huge command, and it's really being accepted. So, I mean, this is not a small, achievement. And our startups, I mean, we are supposed to be the startup nation. That is why United States has signed this very, very important agreement, the Initiative for Critical and Emerging Technologies, ICET, and many things are being covered under that. So certainly, and of course, our Indians are working even in the Philippines. They are in top Indian companies and other companies. And I think they're employing 150,000 Indian IT companies in the Philippines. So in that sense, we're providing a lot of training, a lot of support, a lot of capability, like defense. Now we want to become one of the top countries in defense production. So we are giving a lot of incentives for that. And that is why we're coming up with even better defense, products, which can help other countries. And that's why you can see that our strategic partnership with Vietnam and Philippines is really growing, and we're being looked at as a trusted partner.
So we'll have Dr. Banlawi and then Professor Guillermo. Okay.
Go ahead. The one more. Comment. Sorry.
So,
Hello. Yeah, so this question is connected to Professor Rakisa's question. Recently, we've heard of the so-called chip wars, wherein and of course, it's so important in this particular area of the world where Taiwan is, right? So, this chip wars is supposedly one of the main, they say that it's the kind of declared start of a kind of Cold War part 2, right? And the impetus of this chip war is that the United States has decided that it cannot allow China to develop the capacity to produce the most advanced chips, and particularly in the area of artificial intelligence, which is also another big issue at the moment. So this has created a very delicate situation also in that area of Taiwan. Now, this has something to do with what Professor Rakiza asked about India. For example, India also has its own ambitions in terms of developing its technological infrastructure, its capacities and capabilities, or maybe also in the area of chips production, of advanced chips production. So what is at stake here in this chip war, wherein the US seems to be asserting its capacity to monopolize control over the production of the most advanced chips in the world, to the possible ambitions of other countries like India, which may in the future, of course, want to produce these chips on its own and have this kind of capacity. And looking also at ASEAN or Southeast Asia in general, of course, we're still very far from developing those kinds of capacities. But what is really at stake in ASEAN in this chip wars? Do we have anything at stake? Should we really play any role in fortifying the monopoly of the United States, the virtual monopoly and control over the production of advanced chips? So I think this is very important also for India, that they see the future and how they want to develop their own systems and high-tech productive capacities.
Before Dr. Marwa answers that, can we have one more comment from the back? Haydarian. Can we have Richard Haydarian first? Yeah.
Hello. Yeah, thank you. Actually, my fear came through that if you put South Asians and Filipinos in one room, you're going to have a hard time finding enough time. So I'm going to keep this very, very quick. First of all, I just have a concern about this overemphasis on trade as an expression of influence, because if you look at it, the terms of trade with China is not very good for most of us. We're running huge deficits with China. In fact, this was openly mentioned during the joint statements of President Marcos Jr. during his visit to China. Not to mention, we see as China rose, there's a lot of deindustrialization happening in this part of the world. We used to make a lot of low-end manufacturing. Most of that was gone. But more importantly, we see that it's really strategic infrastructure investment, which is really a good expression of influence. And this is where Japan does a very, very good job. If you look at the real numbers, Japan beats by far China in actual, not pledge, but actual investment pledges in the Philippines, in places like Indonesia and Vietnam, among others. So I think I see that a lot of journalistic, headlines overemphasize the trade issue. But what I really want to know about is, I've been asking Jai Shankar questions from Raisina in 2017 to Munich Security Conference last year. I noticed there's a change in tone, but also it looks at, I call it like if the Chinese had Wolf Warrior diplomacy, now it looks like we have RRR diplomacy, that Netflix show. A lot of hawkishness is coming out there, which I didn't see from India before. What's going on there? Because I think the Ukraine issue really has exposed the fault lines within the Quad. It doesn't look like the solid so-called Asian NATO that it was just 16 months ago, right? Now things are looking very, very different. So I really want to get your point of view as an Indian expert. Like, where is Quad going? Because if things are not gonna look good, my suspicion is the Philippines is gonna come in and other countries. Like the Philippines right now is already looking at trilateral, quadrilateral, security cooperation, and we're all allies, unlike you guys. We're a non-aligned country. So I'm just really concerned. I really want to get your point of view on that. Thank you.
Should I take yours first, if you don't mind? Yeah. All right. So yes, you rightly mentioned that India's policy towards Russia has not been in tandem with the rest of the Quad countries and the West. But this is because we believe that we should have an independent foreign policy. And we are also not very confident of the United States coming to us when we need them the most, because through history, we've known that. We've known that through history, that whenever we needed them the most, they ditched us just at that time. Whether it was food insecurity, which they brought to us in the late 60s, or whether it was the war with Pakistan, So on several occasions, the US has let us down, and we can never not even be sure whether they will help us if the Chinese transgress in the Himalayas. Number two, Russia, on the other hand, has supported India on such occasions when India needed USSR's support. And that is why it kinds of fulfills that need which we have at this time. And we are importing 1 million barrels of oil a day. 1 million barrels of oil a day from Russia, which is undoubtedly helping to improve their capacity to attack Ukraine. We know that because they earn the money from us, and that helps them, their economy, get by. But this is the way, like you said, wolf warrior diplomacy, but this is what India says. And our Prime Minister did make a statement saying that this is not the time, this is not the era of war. So in our own way, and right now the G20 also, it was 18 countries. So barring Russia and China, all 18 were of the firm opinion that the Russian aggression in Ukraine should stop. So, but we have been abstaining from voting in the United Nations because of the simple reason that we want also not to, openly show that we are not with the Ukraine kind of crisis. And from Ukraine, we have, when the crisis happened, there were a lot of students from South Asian countries who were studying in Ukraine. So almost 20,000 students were brought back through Indian forces safely back to their countries. So, I mean, in that sense, we've kept this kind of balance, but we also know that, yes, we have a lot to answer to the international community, because we always say peace and, harmony and all of that shared vision for countries. But yes, the Russia-Ukraine crisis has kind of led us to move in a certain way, behave in a certain way. Yes, as far as the chip manufacturing is concerned, actually that's going to be one of the elements of our cooperation under ICET. And the entire conflict over Taiwan is also about chips, really, because Taiwan is #1 in chip making. So whether it's the US wanting to invest in Taiwanese security, or whether it is China, angling for Taiwan, it is really because of the fact that Taiwan has been doing, is the #1 chip maker in the world. Yeah, but US and India are working together on chips, and we are also encouraging domestic production through our production-linked incentive schemes, which have worked a lot in building certain manufacturing capacities. Because actually what we did was that we leapfrogged to services and we neglected our manufacturing sector. And that is why India too, despite the fact that our relations with China nosedived from 2017 onwards, our trade has only been growing. And it's the same with the United States. $100 billion deficit with China that India has alone, so it's a huge amount. And that is what Ambassador, Jaishankar has also been asked on several occasions. China wants that whatever conflicts there are, they continue, and the economic cooperation, trade, investment, all of that continues simultaneously. And but Jaishankar has made it very clear that unless there is peace at the border, we cannot have economic cooperation as before. That is why so many apps were banned. Investments have been, highly scrutinized. Several Chinese companies had to close down in India. So they are, getting it back in that sense, because we don't want that, China keeps us engaged at the border and in the Indian Ocean, and on the other hand says that we should have, the rest of the relationship going as normal. All their 276 apps were banned. So all of that we did.
So we have 3 more people left. So we'll start with Professor Moratilla, and then Zach, and then Dr. Banlawi.
Thank you, Professor Marwa, for that great presentation. And thank you also for raising the alarm earlier as part of the presentation. The potential involvement of the Philippines, unfortunately, should the tensions in the region escalate into a full-scale war involving, of course, the 2 superpowers, China and the United States. I'd like to begin with that dark and pessimistic statement, okay? Because in the process, of course, there's always this possibility that we could be torn to shreds if this conflict happens between the 2. That's the first. And then the second is actually a question. Much of your presentation actually zeroed in on the Quad, but we know, of course, that India, as far as its foreign policy is concerned, also goes into or tries to employ multi-alignment strategies. There is the BRICS, for instance, which was established earlier than the Quad, and well, unlike the Quad, which for the most part, of course, is just on strategy, BRICS, of course, is more on trade, economic development, and so forth. And then apart from that, there are also accounts pointing to the BRICS as a more dynamic and more active alliance. So I'd like to find out currently what is the attitude towards, or the actual involvement of India is as far as BRICS and other alliances are concerned.
Just a short response. India is this year also chair of SCO. So we are also members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Yeah, SCO. And we are also vice president of the AIIB, which is China-led. So both of these are China-led, yeah. We are also members of IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa. So we are engaged in several groupings. And for all of these also, again, development issues in BRICS has been more prominent. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Zachary Lavengood, visiting scholar from Charles University in the Czech Republic. There's been a lot of discussion here about ASEAN, especially ASEAN centrality, and of course, on the matter of Chinese influence. I'm wondering, how can ASEAN members who are in disputes with China rely on ASEAN centrality when there are members who clearly speak with China's voice on matters which would slow or disrupt regional issues which are sensitive to China's agenda? And these relationships are growing only deeper, not just with financial investments, but there have been satellite images released now of China's second overseas military base, which they're making in Cambodia, which the most recent satellite imagery shows that it is actually their largest peer is large enough now to host aircraft carriers, which of course China is going to be finishing their third very soon, which would allow it to project its power even further into the Indian Ocean. So how can other states which are wary of China rely on this institution whenever there are a fair number of members now who are, I don't want to say dancing to China's tune, but they're listening to the music much more than others?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dulce. Dulce told me that I'll be the last commentator, and I don't mind because I can always say my last word. And I'm very grateful to Dr. Marwa for a very comprehensive and well-informed discussions. You tackled a lot of issues that I think we will discuss for many more years to come. And it will be a subject of discussions not only by established scholars, but also by young and emerging scholars in this region we call Indo-Pacific. And so that is, in fact, my question on whether there is an agreement among us that there is the rise of the Indo-Pacific as a region, or whether this is just an evolving concept. Because on the comment of Dr. Santa Maria, there's a proposal to make the Indo-Pacific as a zone of culture, which I think is very promising. But if you will look at history as discussed by Don, this region that we call Indo-Pacific used to be called Indo-West Pacific, or in other literature, it was called Indo-Pacific Asia. So do we really have an agreement of this region? And on the basis of your presentation, I see a lot of Western narrative, you know, string of pearls, wolf warrior diplomacy, and even the concept of Indo-Pacific itself was coined by American strategic thinkers, mainly by both Allen and Hamilton group of companies, you know, propagating all this concept. But I'm more interested to hear from you on real India's perspective of the Indo-Pacific, and on whether India is now acting Indo-Pacific from acting East. And then in ASEAN, we use Indo-Pacific, but there's still a preference to use the term Asia Pacific, and that is clearly articulated and you said that earlier in the ASEAN outlook in the Indo-Pacific. But I want to also know whether there's a SARC outlook of the Indo-Pacific, you know, from South Asia regional cooperation. We want to know more about that. And, you know, you mentioned about string of pearls, but there's another concept, you know, what he called it, the necklace of diamonds to counter the string of pearls. But I remember, you know, when I was still studying in the elementary, that Philippines used to be the pearl, the pearl of the Orient. So that's another concept of that region. That in that conceptualization, in Indo-Pacific, we were pearl of the Orient. And at that time, Indo-Pacific was known as the Orient Seas. You know, the Orient Seas, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. Now you talk about India getting more and more involvements in patrolling the South China Sea. Do I see in the future India talking the possibility of joining US, Philippines, Japan, and Australia in, you know, multilateral patrol in the Indo-Pacific? Now let's talk about ASEAN centrality, as mentioned by Professor Kraft. For me, ASEAN centrality is not taking the lead in the Indo-Pacific. It's just like providing an avenue for all players to discuss, like a mediator rather than a central player, not even a hub. You know, it's just like a facilitator. You know, just like Dulce here, you're the central player, but Dulce facilitates, and that for me, that's the role of ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific. Can ASEAN stay together? That's the problem of playing this centrality. We lack the ASEAN unity in even how to deal with China, and in the United States, even handling Myanmar, we lack that kind of unity. And lastly, I would like to ask these two contesting models, because you talk about models, you know, the Indian model, the Chinese model, the US model. But this is the model of the United States that I think you excellently articulated earlier, but failed to mention the free, open, and rules-based Indo-Pacific. But China has a different model. It's still open, but inclusive world. So what's your take on that? Thank you.
So India has already articulated its Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. And with this Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, we have mainly 7 pillars, including maritime security, maritime ecology, maritime resources. So we are wanting the engagement of ASEAN countries and bringing ASEAN countries on board this concept. So this has been a great endeavor of Prime Minister Modi especially since last year. And ever since ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific came, because even ASEAN has been reluctant to talk of the Indo-Pacific. They also, most countries prefer to use Asia Pacific. So till now, we only have Indonesia on board, you see. Because Indonesia is the one who also crafted the ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. So in that sense, I mean, India is giving a lot of importance to IPOI and Indo-Pacific. And we want to be absolutely in the center of all engagements that happen with the Indo-Pacific, because we are also seeing this as, you know, the like-minded democracies, and we are wanting to show that, yes, India is an assertive power in itself. Yeah. Multilateral approach. Yes, certainly, because India wants to play a greater role. And now its sensitivity towards China has declined substantially. So earlier it was very, very sensitive to, you know, China's, how it would react, but not anymore. And that's why we are not kind of fearing what China thinks or what China will say or what China will do. Because now we've reached that level where we know that China needs us more than we possibly need China.
Question.
Yeah, just my comment. I was wondering if you could respond on how ASEAN members who have disputes with China, ongoing disputes, how they can still rely on this centrality of ASEAN whenever you have other ASEAN members who are increasingly listening to the agenda and speaking with the voice of China within the ASEAN forum. You know, first thing that comes to mind is, of course, you know, the issues in the South China Sea, codes of conduct, things like that. But not only are they expanding their financial investments with China, but they're also expanding their security investments with China, specifically Cambodia and their the new Chinese naval base.
That is a huge challenge, as we all agree, that ASEAN centrality gets extremely compromised. And with this base that is expected to come up in Cambodia, though Cambodia is still downplaying it and saying that it will not be a military base, so to say. But certainly the danger and threat is there. And I think that, you know, the United States and other Western powers are also increasingly aware of this. And, you know, they will be taking steps, because more and more maritime exercises and more overflights and things are happening.
Yeah, I'm actually not a political, you know, but I'm a technical person and also in business administration. Now, in this topic, we basically concentrate on Indo-Pacific, and the central, the theme is China. And then now it seems India want to, you know, somehow get into that one. And I actually prefer like cooperation between India, Indo-Pacific. But when it comes to China, China Belt and Road initiatives, it extend up to Africa. And the next market is Africa. You can see now most of the countries now growing. Earlier we talking about Ethiopia and all these countries, and they are growing very fast. So now in this system, if you only take this part, so how about the balance of that one? China will move into that one, still be stronger, and will not be able to, you know, tackle that that problem. So how we actually go for cooperation rather than the competition? Because I see all these actually competing each other. So as you know, I'm also representing Asia Pacific, you know, technical cooperation. So that kind of model can we propose? I'm not political guy. I prefer to that one. In business, yes, we have to cooperate, you know, compete and get the markets. But in this initiative, you know, any country, maybe India or anyone can, someone already actually suggested that one. Because Africa also be part of this one. Otherwise, you won't be able to bring all these into one table, especially to bring economy, peace, and stability into this region. Not only this region, the beyond that one. Thank you.
So I think India is also engaged a lot in Africa. Our Tata company is there into various aspects of business. Others are also there. We have ONGC, we have Adani, Reliance, and several big companies there, and several Indians doing very well there, holding senior positions in major companies in Johannesburg and Durban. So it's not that India is not there, and we have our own grouping with Africa as well. Of course, we have IBSA, and we also have another grouping which started with Indonesia. So Indonesia, India, and Africa Growth Corridor. Asia, Africa Growth Corridor. So it's AAGC. So again, we cannot leave Africa out because Africa is also very, very central. Yeah.
So maraming salamat. Thank you very much for sharing all your ideas and for making this a very rich discussion. Now, before we go to the closing remarks, we have something for Dr. Marwa. And can we ask Dean Sevilla and also Assistant Dean for Public Affairs, Antoinette Rakisa, to come forward? Okay. Sa gitna na lang tayo. You can.
So I'll just read the certificate of appreciation. This certificate is awarded to Dr. Rina Marwa for serving as a speaker during the roundtable discussion, The Rise of Indo-Pacific Entanglements with China and Southeast Asia, held on 7 March 2023 at the UP Asian Center. Given this 7th day of March 2023 at the UP Asian Center, Diliman, Quezon City, from our Dean, Henelito Sevilla. So we'd like to call on the discussants, Professor Herman Joseph Graff, for serving as the discussant during the roundtable discussion, The Rise of the Indo-Pacific Entanglements with China and Southeast Asia, held on the 7th of March 2023 at the UP Asian Center. Given the 7th day of March 2023 at the UP Asian Center, Diliman, Quezon City, signed by our Dean, Henelito Sevilla. And of course, we also have a certificate of appreciation to Dr. Matthew Santa Maria for serving as a discussant during the roundtable discussion, The Rise of the Indo-Pacific Entanglements with China and Southeast Asia, held on 7th March 2023 at the UP Asian Center, given this 7th day of March 2023 at the UP Asian Center, Diliman, Quezon City. Thank you so much.
So for the closing remarks, may we call on Professor Jofe Santarita, our former dean here at the UP Asian Center.
Indeed, this is the last word. But before that, namaskar, good afternoon. I'd like to perhaps ask a question to Dr. Marwa, because we are too eager to look at the outside perspective on the Indo-Pacific, but maybe it's also good to look at what is the perspective of the insiders, particularly of the Northeast region, the chicken neck of India, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. So the idea of Indo-Pacific is believed to have started, as discussed by Professor Marwa. It was actually introduced by the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Mentioned about the confluence of the two seas, which is actually in his speech before the Indian Parliament in the summer of 2007. So the phrase was was drawn from the little book of written by Dara Shikoh, a Mughal prince, in 1655. Now, in recent times, the Indo-Pacific has gained its currency among bureaucrats, scholars, and the like. In fact, a good number of individuals knew Indo-Pacific as a new geographical and strategic frame of reference to replace Asia-Pacific construct. One of the popular definitions is associated with the USA efforts to contain the rising military, and we are talking about economic capabilities of China, a situation which many observers inevitably liken to a cold-blooded Cold War style geopolitical strategy. The said efforts are further triggered by the rise of China and the subsequent implementation of the near $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative projects. Though this initiative, through this initiative, China has expanded this economic and to some extent, some argue as military foothold in the Indian Ocean. As a concept, can also be read as a code for containing China. And we talk about the quadrilateral or Quad 2.0 in recent times. So the Indo-Pacific approach from an Indian perspective, and I think Prof. Rina mentioned that quite well this afternoon, covers three specific features. India perceives the Indo-Pacific as an opportunity that allows for expansion of India's imprint across the region, as it faces considerable limitations in terms of capital. I think Don mentioned that a while ago, and capacity. At the same time, this approach places several collaborations at the center of India's interest in Indo-Pacific area. While partnerships with Australia, France, Japan, and the USA have provided a greater platform for India to expand its diplomatic imprint, India's relationship with island nations, and I think I have to point this out, with Seychelles, for instance, Maldives, and other small islands, even the Pacific Islands, which influence its role in the Indo-Pacific region. Due to this geographic closeness or geographical proximity on the island states, as I mentioned, to India, the foreign policy choices of these island states will have a direct effect to the security landscape of India. Despite the many meanings, in fact, it's not only India's perspective, but we have France and mentioned a while ago, the term and visions of the Indo-Pacific region to the member states of ASEAN have taken note of the idea. So the 10 member states, including the Philippines, adopted the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, or AOIP, as mentioned by Prof. Rina. This was actually introduced in 2019, and this document officially serves as guide for ASEAN in its engagement with countries located along the Pacific and Indian Ocean. So the ASEAN has acknowledged the implications of the Indo-Pacific to Southeast Asian region, and foremost are the opportunities for economic expansion, maritime cooperation, and connectivity, among others. Indeed, the geographical space of a multipolar Indo-Pacific offers many opportunities as well as risks. It is important to ASEAN countries, no matter how imperfect it is, to consciously leverage on the opportunities of cooperation on maritime issues, economic expansion, and connectivity and other areas. So in fact, a few days ago, I went to the Northeast region, and they keep on talking about connectivity, and there's so many connectivities, mobilities, and the likes that we can consider seriously. So in order for ASEAN to navigate the multipolar Indo-Pacific to its advantage, it should consistently maintain its centrality. And we have so many criticisms on centrality and the domestic concerns of its member states. It should be noted that this kind of response of the member states at the regional or global level is affected by its domestic affairs. Thus, it is important that ASEAN capitalize on the AOIP by making ASEAN centrality as the main principle in promoting collaboration in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think I'll end that because I have so many things to say, but given the time constraint. But lastly, I should definitely perform a task this afternoon to give the closing remarks. And I would like to show the Asian Center's appreciation the Indian way. So I would like to express the vote of thanks. This is an Indian way. To Prof. Rina Marwa for graciously sharing to us the ideas of Indo-Pacific, and to our reactors, Prof. Santa Maria and Prof. Herman Kraft, for enriching discussions and sharing. And of course, to the participants for your questions and participation to make this inaugural lecture a success. So maraming salamat. Mabuhay India, Jai Hind Philippines.
We'll have a picture taking. Can we all go to the front? Pwedeng makatulong. Oh, U-shape na lang tayo, U-shape.